You know, if there's one thing humans have always been good at, it's adapting. We did it when moving north, surviving conditions we had no business being in. We did it when settling the Andes, 14,000 feet above sea level. We've done it in the middle of the ocean, which is absurd to even think about. And eventually, we did it everywhere else as well. But while these are all incredible examples of human ingenuity in their own right, the only thing I can think about when I see footage of the Bajua people effortlessly diving to depths of 200 feet is, what if the environment isn't natural? Or I mean, don't get me wrong, nature can be brutal. It's consistently the architect of some of the most dangerous places on the planet, with energy expressions that are still powerful enough to destroy almost anything. But nature is subject to rules and regulated by the ecological constraints on Earth. So if those constraints are removed and the place in question has the freedom to be shaped by nothing but human forces, what would happen? What would happen to us? Well, for almost 100 years, there was a city like that, and it was so unregulated that it slipped past every safeguard a city normally has. It was so dense that it absolutely violated the mathematic principles of city planners. It was so trapped by man-made pressures that the entire city was confined to 6.4 acres of land, which meant the only direction the city could grow was up. And because it could only grow up, the lower levels were caught in a perpetual state of darkness. But here's the thing, even as crime syndicates filled the power vacuum, even as the population swelled past 40,000, this dark, dense, lawless city survived. Which begs the question, how? The city was Kowloon, and what you're about to see is a small glimpse into what living in the city was like. Yeah, it was dark, and kind of looks like a cross between a favela and a jungle gym. But every environment, be it natural or man-made, is a product of the pressures around them, with the life forms that follow embodying the solution to those pressures. So when a place looks like this, it means something extreme had to be driving it. And a good place to start is that Kowloon was never meant to be a city. Originally, it was a military fort, designed to secure a foothold near British Hong Kong. But by the late 1800s, Hong Kong was booming, trade was excellent, the population exploded, and the surrounding infrastructure just wasn't enough to handle the growth. So, after a lengthy back and forth, Britain and China agreed to a lease on new territories. The compromise was that a small sliver of land, surrounded by a sea of British territory, would remain under Chinese control. That land was Kowloon. But there's only so much you can do when you're in the middle of somebody else's territory. And so, China tried to govern it but couldn't do so effectively. Britain wanted to annex it but couldn't do so legally. The result was perhaps the rarest environmental condition possible, a gray zone between two different superpowers, where two systems of governance meet, but none rule. And when a space like this opens up, if there's an opportunity, it will be filled. I say this because in ecology, there's a principle for it, and it has to do with how ecosystems organize. In general, ecosystems tend to settle in a pattern where different species occupy different roles. From the outside, this looks like a form of harmony, but what's really going on is that the species that avoid competing do better in the long run. And so, instead of different life forms fighting over the exact same resources, life spreads out. Some animals are active during the day, others only at night. Some compete by growing better in the sunlight, while others adapt by getting better at growing in the shade. This continues until almost every niche or opportunity is filled. However, one edge case is so potent, so alluring, that it can completely destroy this entire pattern, and it happens when a niche is empty. Suddenly, the tight competition loops that keep everything balanced are broken, and the life form that moves into the empty space the fastest does the best. This is why invasive species like cane toads wreak absolute havoc. This is why removing wolves from Yellowstone did this. But the reason why I bring this up is because no matter the reason for the niche being empty, be it the removal of a species or the reintroduction of another one, the outcome is always the same: the creation of an extreme environment. But obviously, humans are very complex, and just because a space opens up doesn't mean people are going to move into it, right? Wrong. Because not long after this space was created, another pressure displaced so many people that they had no choice but to leave. War. At first, it started slowly, when a civil war broke out in China. But while the fighting is what dominated headlines, so much more was taking place behind the scenes, as, along with the usual costs, civilians faced food scarcity, random seizures of property, and local governments that could collapse at any moment. So, with their old lives threatened, many started moving south. But with no papers, no money, and no legal status, Hong Kong wasn't an option. And so, people settled for the only thing left: Kowloon. But while the Civil War gradually increased its population, a much larger threat accelerated everything: Japan, which not only launched a full-scale assault on China, committing terrible acts while doing so, but also tore down the walls around Kowloon, suddenly making the area much more accessible. The result was a slow displacement turning into a mass panic-level migration, peaking in 1949, right after the Civil War had ended. So together, we have a completely accessible empty space with no laws, and a massive group of people with nowhere else to go. Under different conditions, maybe these two pressures wouldn't have translated to much, but together, with just the right timing, the outcome was this: hell on earth. At least, that's what it was called from the outside. From the inside, maybe that label wasn't entirely unjustified, as despite the massive influx of people, this place was still boxed in by British territory, and as a result, permanently confined to 6.4 acres of space. That's less than 5 football fields. That's small enough that you can walk across it in 2 minutes. And yet, despite that, by the late 1980s, the city's population was estimated to be between 30,000 and 50,000 people, all living in less than 5 football fields of space. Bruh. That is insane. And to give you an idea of just how insane that was, here's a graph of some of the densest cities on the planet. And even from the beginning, we have some outliers, like Tokyo, the most populated city in the world. Sao Paulo, sitting at a density of approximately 8,000 people per square kilometer. New York, scaling that number all the way up to 11,000. Mumbai in India, almost doubling New York's density. And finally, the outlier among outliers, Manila in the Philippines, sitting at a whopping 43,000 people per square kilometer. Truly the densest city on the planet, and a marvel of how we humans can adapt our infrastructure to make any space work. Until we get to Kowloon, sitting at a ridiculous 1,255,000 people per square kilometer. That is roughly 29 times the density of Manila and completely shatters every single math framework designing a city depends on. Yeah, this place should not have worked. But hold on, I think I've seen this before. It's interesting how life is able to turn a bad situation into an amazing one, often because, they have to. But sometimes, some life forms take it even further, building their entire strategy around what would otherwise be catastrophic. Across the world, there are many extremes we can point to, but only one of these is something life creates for itself: density. However, despite the fact that density leads to this, despite the fact that it makes diseases spread faster or food run out quicker, eusocial insects depend on it. These beasts live in, require a colony of thousands, with some species peaking at 22 million. On average, however, colonies sit at around 1,000 individuals per square meter, which doesn't sound crazy, but if I compare that level of density to Kowloon, that's the difference between this and this. However, if there is one word that describes eusocial colonies best, it definitely isn't chaotic. These insects organize on that scale, all while being completely decentralized. Only possible because individuals specialize to such a degree that the entire colony behaves like a superorganism. And guess what? Insects aren't the only ones capable of doing this. So it should come as no surprise that many of the structural features present in Kowloon share a strong resemblance to those found in animal colonies living under the same conditions, such as alleyways that mirror internal tunnels, the continuity that makes everything look like one building, the vertical presence that acted like an emergent ventilation system. But you'd be wrong to suspect this was purposeful. There was no architect, no central authority to guide decision-making, so each resident built what the available space would allow, solving their own problems to do so. Sound familiar? Well, that's because that's how individuals in eusocial colonies specialize. They start with small genetic differences that get reinforced as they solve problems. In Kowloon, residents moved in with different skill sets. As they focused on solving the problems they were best at, more people would approach them and reinforce or copy their solutions. Given enough time, this led to functional clusters that arose organically. Dentists, metalworkers, and noodle shops all stationed on the ground floors, triads that almost acted like security stationed on the third floors, family, relatives, and the rest of the community living on the fourth floors and above. But at the time, there were no broadcasts, no phones, and no screens, so in order to communicate, information had to travel person to person. But with almost no open spaces, it was the network of paths between the clusters that gave the city its structure. And this is perfectly documented in the film and later book, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, where William Wright sets out to understand how human behavior shapes cities. He visits alleyways and studies plazas, takes trips to malls and evaluates staircases, often using time lapses to compare the foot traffic in different areas. But as he does, many of the most expensive, well-designed third spaces are empty, while in-between places like street corners or stair landings always seem to be packed with people. Why? You're not going to believe this, but it's because of accidents. At a basic level, to intentionally socialize, someone has to decide they want to, which takes commitment. But in accidental interactions, when you're already going somewhere else, socializing has no commitment, so it doesn't take much. Because it doesn't take much, accidental encounters actually happen much more frequently. But if certain places, like say a street corner where many paths meet, were to force people to move through one area, what do you think would happen? Well, it would increase the number of unplanned encounters, and along with it, the amount of time people spend in that area. Eventually, other people will see that and start responding, setting up shops or stands or art or entertainment until the city itself follows, reinforcing the successful point by adding to the surrounding area. This is how something like a downtown gets created. It's, at a very simplified level, accidental meeting points that get reinforced over time. But obviously, cities have laws and designers and architects that, at the very least, play just as much if not a larger role in shaping our cities. However, if all those other factors are removed, well, how people interact can still organize a city. And that's so interesting to me because it's in the exact same way life has figured out how to do it in the past. Simple, repeated interactions that reinforce the pathways used most. Now, keep in mind, I'm not trying to reduce people to eusocial animals. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that under similar conditions, intelligence tends to converge on similar solutions. And that solution was a super level of cooperation, which is why I think Kowloon was alive. A superorganism that was able to overcome war, density, darkness, and so much more because the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. And this is evident in the behavior of the people who live there. Ever wonder how a place this cramped, despite existing for almost 100 years, never burned down? Well, it's because of the people who handled firefighting communally, almost like an immune response. Ever wonder how a place this packed was able to provide electricity and water for everyone who lived there? Well, they stole it by tapping into Hong Kong's power grid and pipes, sure, but they created a decentralized network, spanning rooftop tanks and ad hoc wiring so that if there was a failure at any point, it was local and not system-wide. They created a mini economy where production, consumption, and waste removal all happen on top of each other, minimizing the distance of the supply chain so that there were fewer points where the entire system could collapse from. And look, I'm not saying that it didn't have its problems. There was conflict between triad groups, conflict from external raids, conflict because so many people had to share such little space. But even with that being true, I don't think that in any way detracts from this place being alive, because every living system, be it a beehive with its predictable patterns of conflict, or your own body which sometimes has to target its own cells, needs periods of conflict. So if anything, I would argue that that's proof of life, proof of the dynamic entity that is a superorganism. and as families aged out, left, or were replaced by the younger generation. As the city was torn down and everyone was eventually forced out, the system as a whole survived, continuing to live on in even many of the most popular forms of art today, because life isn't determined by the individual components that make up a system. It's determined by the interaction that comes from the individual components that make up a system. Thanks for watching.